All right, let's get started. I had announced on Wednesday that I wanted to address the question of Israel and Palestine, as well as the concept of anti-Semitism, to walk you through a practical application of the consequences of the approaches to history rooted in different epistemology that we've been discussing so far, to which I believe I can show these approaches, these political responses can be traced. Although, of course, there are in politics many positions that people take simply because they consider it to be in their interest. So they form an opinion and then they find justifications or pretext. That too is a distinct possibility. We don't always have to assume that there is a coherent framework at work, other than, to say that, yes, self-interest, however that may be defined, too, provides a fairly coherent framework. But at the same time, as people who study history and who want to be scrupulous in pointing towards the faults and attempting to not let criticism go because it seems to contradict what we want to achieve. In other words, to actually be able to reflect on our own position and not shut our own interest off from criticism is a necessity, or else we'll get inferior results. So there is, on the one hand, that, and the American historical profession today is full of people who will say, sure, but we don't want to go there because that will help the enemy. And that is a bad argument to make. So there were discussions about all the big burning issues, like to what extent do we apply categories of race and gender in our research, for instance. That seems to be a perpetual one. And there is on the dominant liberal side, as well as on the conservative side, that has the air supremacy, air superiority in all the newspapers and journals, very much interested argument. And then there is also the Cassandra effect, that if people are doomsayers and they point out stuff that is flawed, they will often draw the rest of people. Reminds me of that one time when we visited a youth hostel in Germany, and one of us saw that there was mold on the liverwurst. It's a very easy to rot product. Did you hear about the Listerine cases that killed this 88-year-old guy, liverwurst from Boar's Head? Yeah. And that reminded me of it when I read it in the paper today. Anyway, so being a good citizen, he took the liverwurst from the buffet to the director of the youth hostel and said, hey, I noticed that there is some mold on the liverwurst. I thought you might want to exchange that for a fresh one. And he immediately snapped, yelled, accused the person of besmirching his reputation and so forth. So it was a classical example of how something that probably is actually on you, that is wrong, is pointed out to you, and you respond to that with anger, denial, and so forth. Just take the damn liverwurst and toss it and get a fresh one. It's not that difficult. So the Middle East is, of course, full of rotten liverwurst that we want to take the time to address in order. Now, as a starting point, however, it would be wrong from a strictly humanist point of view to ignore the unnecessary human suffering. In Palestine, you have had, since the attack of October 7th, an Israeli war that has taken decidedly genocidal dimension, the sheer scale of it, the indiscriminateness of it, the cruelty of some of the warfare, the sheer numbers the number of children, the educational institutions and hospitals. All of that is unfathomable and incredibly wrong, and a major violation of human rights. And, for people who feel capable of empathy toward others in general and don't draw a line to say, well, this is the enemy and we don't have that there, that's a barbaric attitude to take. And I think no discussion of the Middle East at this point can do without doing full justice to the scale, scope, and wrongness of the Israeli response in Palestine. So that's one thing. And I think I started with Edward Said as somebody who I felt was worthy of much criticism. As a Palestinian, he had made Palestinian independence his cause. I mentioned also Salih al-Kabawi, whose death, ultimately, that is the responsibility of Fresno State. I use it as an example of a kind of repressive turn in how people deal with facts, evidence, etc., in a nominalist way, where what is true and what is good and just becomes a matter of power. Can you get away with it? And of course, Salih al-Kabawi was a strong advocate for Palestinian independence. On the other hand, we have examples like the leading progressive faculty members who are clustered in the Department of English and who published a statement in the Collegian almost immediately after the October 7th Hamas attack on Israeli civilians, as well as military personnel on border patrols. This response by the English department, have you read it? Am I the only one who reads that stuff? Maybe I should just stop because it's not good for my constitution. I can say that much. It was a response to the statements put out by the university system, which focused on empathy for the victims, for the Israeli victims of this terror attack, and criticized Hamas for this terror attack. That seems to me, again, a fairly normal, human, and legitimate response. If you study the ideas that Hamas represents, as I've done, if you take it seriously as an example of Islamofascism, if you take it seriously as something that is rooted in a tradition of thought that goes back to some of the most reactionary elements of European thought, many judgments on Hamas are possible, but not to say, with the infamous words of Judith Butler in 2006, that Hamas, quote, is part of the global left. If Hamas, as an organization that is fully steeped in a religious fascist worldview, is part of the global left, then please explain to me what you mean by a left. A left that since the French Revolution has come to represent advocacy for the common people, democratic participation from the bottom up, equal rights, freedom of speech, religion, and so forth, social, economic equality, and all those kinds of things. None of that. An organization that wants national independence on the basis of an ethno-religious program, the better to position your nation state on a capitalist world market represents. And that is what Hamas is. In the same fashion, of course, this enthusiasm for religious fundamentalism among identitarian liberals and their progenitors goes back all the way to Foucault, the man himself, who in 1980 came out in favor of the Ayatollah Khomeini, saying that this was a great example of somebody who broke out of the duality of capitalism versus communism. And it really showed that Sartre's accusation against Foucault as early as the 1950s that primarily his project was one of anti-communism was not that far-fetched. So for the English department and its statement to articulate why they believe that to criticize Hamas was an act of anti-Arab racism, it requires to understand their view of the situation, which is that the Palestinian people are the original and legitimate owners of this land. They expressly use the analogy to say, and this is the same as with Native Americans who were displaced by white settlers in this country. So they are appealing to Fresno State to apply the same logic to which the school has committed in dealing with the taking of Native American land, and take the logical next step and apply the same logic to Israel and Palestine, and come to the conclusion that Palestine has a right to the entirety of the Holy Land, and that Israel has no right to it, that the existence of Israel is an act of occupation in and of itself, and that any act of resistance, no matter what form it takes, and no matter by what ideology it is backed, is therefore justified. So this is the position that speaks from that piece of writing and argument. Israel is a settler colonialist transplant state of white people. The resistance, the Palestinians, is their land. They are original inhabitants, native, colonized, subaltern people. So these are two positions. And then the third one is the hardcore Zionist position, if you will, that argues in similarly identitarian terms that it's a nation-state-based world. And if you are a people, and if you have a right to exist, and if you're recognized as such, then you have a right to a nation-state. And that nation-state has a right to be sovereign, self-governing on its own territory, secure in its borders, and recognized by others. And therefore, Israel naturally has a right to self-defense. And then from that first principle, which is the problem with first principles, isn't it? From that first principle, just like the one of decolonization, follows that whatever means you apply to that end is justified. There is something amiss with both of these arguments because if the means entails butchering unarmed civilians who are slightly drowsy from spending a night at a rave, and specifically targeting that venue for a murder spree, you have to try again to convince me that this is a means that is in conformity with the legitimate end that you pursue, because I don't understand that. So there is no shortage of murderous, hostile, racially and religiously motivated violence from different sources, different but related sources on both sides. Two competing projects. First, simple nationalist, ethnic nationalist projects, as in a Jewish nation state that is pluralistic and not religious. The tribe, so to speak, has its national identity here, versus the Palestinian project of national liberation as represented by Fatah and the PLO. Then you have a religious turn from the 1990s onward, where on the Israeli side, it is increasingly an ethno-religious project, a theocratic Jewish state, to the exclusion even of secular Jews and liberals and so on. On the other hand, with the dominance of Hamas in Gaza, but also Hamas won the free and fair elections, of course, which the PLO and the Palestinian Authority ignored to continue to govern in the West Bank with Israeli support. Never mind, though Hamas, I think, has more or less dominates discourse in Palestinian society. And their program likewise defines Palestine as an ethno-religious state. So you have two different versions of the same coin, not even two different sides of the coin, equally as worthy of not just criticism, but fundamental rejection. And if you look at Edward Said, and if you look at the criticism of the colonial gaze, and the colonial practice of Europeans in the Arab world, of course, you know that anti-Arab racism is a real motivation for going there and treating the land as disposable and thinking that this is a great idea because who are these Bedouins and occasional city dwellers anyway to make a claim to this land? So the logic of colonialism is part of it. And we, in the 1970s, as school children in Germany, based on official material issued by the West German government to teach us. There was the Federal Central Office for Political Education. Sounds nefarious, but it is what it is. It was set up to create like a common consensus based on democratic values and countering disinformation. So it's not a bad thing at all. But in this particular case, the argument was Israel deserves ownership of that land because they created a flowering landscape where there used to be desert. And the unproductive tribal people who used to roam around there didn't really deserve to have that land because they didn't make use of it. And it kind of, as a child, I thought that made sense. And then later on, I recognized this as the exact same argument that settlers were making when they came to the Americas. Yes, sure, there's natives here, but what do they really do with the land? Look at what we built once we were free to exploit it. And that should that not be enough argument in the spirit of subjugating the world and making it your own? So there is genuinely a whole lot of that going on. That also extends to not a small chunk of European Jewish settlers who came there in the first place, starting in the 1920s. Anti-Arab racism was certainly effective. So I'm not denying that. And I don't think we need to argue that this much because, especially if I am addressing, broadly speaking, the eras of progressives and the eras of the left, what that particular group seems to need more as a reminder is one about, first, anti-Semitism, that's a real thing and what it is. And second, the nature of Hamas and similar organizations as religious fascists, not so unlike the Republican base in the United States, not so unlike the regime in Tehran. So let's zoom in on the anti-Semitism. And let's talk about how that can be defined in a sensible fashion and what we need to take on board to have a true concept of it. First, when it comes to defining what it means, there is now a host of resolutions and laws, regulations, and directives in place where universities, state governments, even Congress, federal agencies, and so on, employ and have embraced a definition of anti-Semitism that says if you criticize the state of Israel, if you voice support for the Palestinians in this conflict, that is what defines anti-Semitism. Opposition to Israel and its policies is anti-Semitism. In Germany, somebody was convicted of a crime for using the phrase "from the river to the sea" in a public chant, on the assumption that this is inherently a Hamas slogan and that Hamas is an anti-Semitic organization. And that is, of course, in Germany, there is no First Amendment to engage in fascist speech, anti-Semitic speech. That is a crime. They will close down newspapers that operate on the same general philosophical level as, say, The Spectator, American Greatness, Breitbart, and so forth. In fact, they closed a major newspaper of the right just a few weeks ago. And they did that because it provided organizational and ideological support to fascists. So in that case, to define anti-Semitism has a criminal law relevance. If you meet that definition, it can get you a criminal conviction. Here, it merely means the difference between being protected by the campus police or being beaten to a pulp by it. So whether or not your presence in a place on campus is going to be interpreted as blocking a pathway, disrupting classes, menacing other students, or whether it's considered a legitimate expression of free speech. You may have got the email yesterday or today clarifying a directive from the chancellor of the university system on prohibited activities. Yes, you read that, and you also understood that to mean no pro-Palestinian camp. As neutral as the language may be. Yes.
You know, it's very interesting because they never really posted about that until people start protesting.
Yeah.
So that's just about that.
And in terms of the broad, repressive, menacing nature of this policy, it matches and in part goes beyond what happened in the 1960s, when Fresno State was certainly at the forefront of the fight against freedom of speech, academic freedom, and so forth. And it's never quite changed its commitment to these reactionary notions. But of course, they don't have to do it themselves because now they have the backing from the chancellor. And they can still say this is all in the interest of freedom of speech. So, but if it is true that a certain kind of speech is inherently a menace to a particular protected category of people, then, the question of identity would come to play. Is the organization not committed or even like mandated to protect that group, or else might incur legal challenges? And of course, there is, as always, there's actually a program, different programs that organizations run, algorithms that spit out a likely result in terms of the cost of ignoring something in legal fees and penalties. A friend of mine who is in public relations and deals with fallout from bad publicity told me that she's aware of the offering. So organizations like this apparently employ this and try to figure out which side do we take here? What kind of stuff do we ignore and what do we go after? What costs us more money? So it's not a moral question at all. It is really just the algorithm that determines what side you're going to take. And then you find the pretext and the arguments. But that said, you have here a legally, in many cases, binding definition of anti-Semitism that says it is support for Hamas, it is criticism of Israel, which really is the same thing. Because according to most people, Palestinian resistance is expressed by Hamas. And in fact, if you follow the logic of that letter by the English department, they say so too. We're with Hamas. Hamas is with us. There is nothing in between the Palestinian struggle against Israel and their methods and means of occupation. It's all one thing. So if that's the case, then yes, you are on board with Hamas. So this is one way of addressing anti-Semitism. Another way of addressing anti-Semitism with a different underlying definition could be found in the renaming of the library. Were any of you involved in that?
No.
Because students were recruited to read the papers of Henry Madden, former director of the library, and whose name was taken off the library. You know why? Have you read the statement? Yeah.
And given like that, really bad that I had done at the line that he then entered the time to along with Germany, though.
Yes.
But on the like everybody having kind of but even social media has made things very complicated because the athlete support Hamas Palestine, the athlete labor that and the some fund to be supported, we also labor that is down. So the very complicated to see what type of story athlete has the more justified support.
I mean, the question of Palestine, Israel, and Hamas did not enter at all into the public discussion of the library, did it? Do you know that?
Not necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was before October 7th, for that matter, but I think also it was operating on a whole different plane of discourse. Madden had been found out by a student of history who ended up being a professor in communication, Bradley Hart, who wrote a book about various supporters of Hitler's in the United States. And Madden was one he found who expressed admiration for the Nazis, support or opposition to Jews on general and racial grounds, and so forth. So, mind you, these were views that he didn't express publicly. They were buried in these letters, uncovered later. Then the history students and their faculty coordinators probed further, uncovered additional evidence, and then wrote a recommendation that lays out why they believe that on that basis, the library should lose the name of Henry Madden. And so this document, in which historians, professional historians, argue why the library needs to be renamed, too, assumes that there is a definition of anti-Semitism that, if met by Madden, means the name should be taken off the building. This definition is also a classical identity-based one that says if it expresses hatred to this group of people based on their race or religion, then it is anti-Semitism. Just in the same way, if people make disparaging remarks about any other group of people based on them belonging to a specific, maybe protected category, because there are some categories that are enumerated under federal law as specifically protected. Others aren't. So if you can document that he hated Jews, that means he is an anti-Semite. So far, so good. The documents, the material proved that by that definition, Madden was clearly an anti-Semite in his heart and mind. He didn't act on that. So the next interesting operation they did two multiple tests, boundary conditions, so to speak. One, how did he deal with other racial and ethnic groups? It turns out he was always evasive when scholars and students who wanted more literature available in the library that deals with issues important to Latinos in Spanish or English, doesn't matter, but that actually speak to the experience of Chicano and Latino people in California. Madden was fighting that, was giving little concessions here and there, was reluctant. So that matches very much the general spirit of the times in 1970s and 80s California, for as late as 1994, I want to say. The state passed a proposition that outlawed the teaching of Spanish and that mandated a Spanish-only policy for all public interactions, if you know that. It made it illegal to teach Spanish, to have Spanish immersion classes in high schools and so on. I think that was Prop 87. And this was 30 years ago. So that's really, really recent. In the 70s and 80s, the level of pushback against any claim that brown people had rights and a history worth teaching and considering was still fought tooth and nail by many. So Madden, in that sense, you could say, see, there is a racist mindset at work that extends to other groups as well. But interestingly enough, in this case, the idea was the conclusion from the document is, see, he wasn't that bad because everybody was like that back in the day. The amount of racism that you had against Mexicans in California, and it's true, if you go by that, you can say he wasn't that bad. So, and that means if you're just a normal, standard, conservative, perhaps, with your prejudices and opinions, if by today's standards that would be racist, fine, but that doesn't mean you're going to have your name taken off the building. Does that matter? Well, all kinds of buildings here have names on them, don't they? By people who are still alive in most cases, which is unheard of in other countries, incidentally. You don't get to have your name on a building unless you're dead. So we have a donor like Shahady owns what company? Producers Dairy. That would be, unheard of. You can't do that. And then Peterson, what do they own?
It's like a metallurgy.
Uh-huh.
They made like
Peters, right?
Yeah, they made machinery.
Uh-huh. But also with an ag
Right.
angle, and funded the whole practice. No, not practice. What's it called?
The business.
No, I mean, like they funded this whole business at Fresno State. This whole practice experience. There's some anti-intellectual catchphrase in there. Something learning. Sorry, I'm blanking on that. Service learning. Specifically to drive back the whole brain learning business that puts ideas into people's heads. So that was the explicit purpose of making it practical, away from these nutty professors and their strange theoretical notions. And so that comes from a certain place that is worthy of criticism, but hey, that's the normal range. So the anti-Semitism, that's different. We don't do that here. And so they go and they do the same operation in the past. Do they do that at his time? Where on earth does he get these notions that Jews are like that? Wait, his professor at Stanford was a German. That's suspicious. Lutz, I think is his name. It turns out I read some of that guy's work. He also studied the merchants of Bremen that I study, and wrote books that were very much in the mainstream. He got his dissertation in Heidelberg on the subject of my hometown's diplomatic representative in Washington, D.C., when Bremen was still an independent city-state, and the role he played toward Lincoln when it came to the mission Lincoln sent him on at the last minute to Richmond, Virginia, to sound out the possibility of peace with the Confederacy. So anyway, I knew the guy who they pointed out that, look, there's a German there, very suspicious. Then also Madden had been to Germany multiple times. He corresponded with Germans. Nobody at Stanford, none of his students, none of his teachers, other than held anti-Semitic views. Clearly, where this came from was Germany. And that is a position to take that requires you to ignore anything and everything anybody has ever studied and published about anti-Semitism and its history in the United States, where, as a matter of course, the discourse of Jews as the enemy was transnational. It bounced back and forth between not just Germany and the US, but a whole bunch of other places. But yes, Germany played an outsized role because, at least until World War I, that was the place where all the elite went for their education if they could. So Heidelberg, Göttingen, Tübingen, those were names that were just as current as Yale and Harvard, and later Stanford in American. So if you had the money and not the brains, then you could go to Stanford. But the idea that there is no endemic anti-Semitism in America, in a place where Henry Ford, you know the story of Henry Ford? Yeah. Where Henry Ford is like playing dumb and saying, oh, that newspaper that I bought and that published my views that I often expressed, I had no idea. And apparently that was also mean to Jews. Well, I'm sorry that happened, when he was sued by the Anti-Defamation League. So no, of course, anti-Semitism was deeply rooted. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan had its big revival. Indiana, Ohio, the Upper South. And it was here, yes, of course, here too. And it was always a matter of driving Jews from public life, not just Black people, not just other non-white people. So to come to the conclusion that to be an anti-Semite in 1930s America meant there had to be a source of infection from abroad is a remarkable view that is nationalist, exceptionalist, and ignorant. But that becomes, the official statement of the department, of the leading voices in the Department of History on that subject. So there's another definition of anti-Semitism that allows you to be against it, but you never get into any fights with people nearby or currently alive. So anti-Semitism is a problem of people who are long dead and who had some exposure to Germany. It is not a problem with, say, the chairperson of the Republican Party in the county of Fresno and his many friends and allies who insisted that the election was stolen and held a rally in support of Mr. Trump on January 6th, coordinated with a national event, and also has been a rabid election as well as COVID denier, etc., etc. So we don't have the time today to go into the specifics of how this is shot through with anti-Semitic ideas. The COVID denial, the social Darwinism in it, the video shown to pump people up at the January 6th rally that preceded the speeches by Trump and others, which preceded the march on the Capitol, was analyzed in Slate, I want to say, by Jason Stanley, who you know as the author of a well-received book on fascism in this country, Fascism and Why It Works, or Why It Works So Well, or something like that.
It's fascism, how it works.
And how it works, right? It's the new edition that's in the works
I
for
read it
25.
myself. Pretty good.
In case Trump wins, it'll be the re-edition will be like, Why Fascism Works So Well.
Yeah. It's a good book. It's a good book.
It is not full of bull, but it is based on the ultimately aloof elitist assumption that fascism is a function of lacking two components: the cosmopolitanism that you get from traveling to Europe on a regular, and the enlightenment you attain by going to Yale. Both of which, of course, Professor Stanley, has enjoyed, and sadly, a majority of Americans, admittedly through no fault of their own, lack. So the question of fighting fascism then becomes one of uplifting and elevating the yokels to the level of Mr. Stanley and his companions. And that's what is so ultimately flawed about that book. Other than that, the material is good, but yeah.
Did you say the lack of cosmopolitanism and the enlightenment of going to jail?
Yale.
Oh,
Yale University,
Oh
not
my
jail.
God.
No,
Okay.
no.
I was confused for a second.
Jason Stanley has never been incarcerated. And if he issues the book with the new title in 2025, it'll stay there. So, like liberals tend to do, you pick fights for the good cause with people who can't hear you and who won't come after you. But you won't say anything about the ones that pay your bills. So if anybody wants to look into the names that adorn other buildings on this campus and their political views and what other political donations they've made, and wants to be expelled, That's a good academic project. You want to get yourself expelled? Huh?
I did a, I,
You did a,
I did a.
oh, that's the one with the service learning, isn't it? Not Peters.
Yeah, he did like volunteer.
Yeah. What was I thinking? Anyways, so here I have now very unsatisfying. I have two different concepts of anti-Semitism. One pushed by the right, one pushed by the liberals, both of which I think are not getting the job done. So you would need a broader, more comprehensive view of anti-Semitism that would also probably explode the narrowness of the ethno-pluralism of identitarian politics that says each identity to its own has its place, has its land, has its culture that is proper to it, and that is distinct from others. This is sort of, the idea that you have cultural appropriation, which is bad, you have land grabs, which is bad, you have one people in one place with one national government, sovereign, and nobody messes with their cultural identity, that's good. So how do you deal with a group like Jews who are homeless politically, who were driven from the Holy Land and dispersed, much like Armenians, much like the Sinti and Roma, and who are a minority wherever they go, first under the umbrella of the Roman Empire, and then sort of when that goes under, tentatively under the authority of the church. But of course, that also splits and comes to be less reliable. In which way do you understand an identity that is Jewish and that takes into account that here you have a people that doesn't check these boxes, that is not at home anywhere? Well, it's precisely the problem that wherever they show up, they're considered to be the despicable minority that is to blame for everything. Where does that come from? And once you ask, honestly, what are the historical circumstances in which this view of the Jew as the money-grubbing, disingenuous, subversive element emerges, you can trace that to the development of capitalism and its various forms and techniques. So what is the specific connection between these two groups? It is not to give away too much. It is not that Jews control finance, in case you thought that isn't it. In fact, in most cases, as a colleague once said, it is not that capitalism is a problem with Jews. It is rather that capitalism also is a problem to Jews. It is like they're not the authors of it, they're not the profiteers of it, but to the extent that the introduction of market relations tends to be a double-edged sword that comes with opportunities and freedoms at the same time as it comes with economic disruption. The group that had been denied opportunities and freedoms on a systematic basis for many years might find themselves most eager to exploit or take advantage of, to put it more neutrally, of sudden openings. So when it comes to a money economy, what was it that Jews could do that Christians were prohibited from doing? Yeah, charge interest, and therefore made money lending a proper business. But of course, the way this went is not that you could just go up to any Jew and ask for money, because no, in fact, on average, Jews were poorer than their Christian counterparts. But since Jewish populations in European medieval cities were concentrated in a neighborhood with walls around it and interacted with the bishop or mayor or king through a representative of their group, they were often asked to provide money, to loan money to these Christian rulers. And they did that by pooling their resources, sort of as a communal effort. Nevertheless, when the bill came due, more often than not, the local noble that had borrowed the money would suddenly discover two things. First, he didn't have the money, and two, they killed our savior. Get your pitchforks. So this kind of reliance on Jews for some economic part and blaming them for the obvious problems that capitalism brings with it at every step of the way is you can link these two things together. The more that capitalist social relations spread, like in the 1810s in Germany, once the market was thrown wide open for British manufactured goods that took out cottage industries and crafts in the cities. At the same time that Jews under post-Napoleonic legislation were able to settle in places where they had been kept out for centuries, there too, you had like this confluence of liberal policies that were both pro-Jewish or against Jewish discrimination and pro-capitalist. And there were enough people who drew the false conclusions from that aha, it's the Jews that are doing this. The same thing repeated in the 1870s and 80s across various agricultural areas where the growth of industrial scale cultivation of grain in particular on the Great Plains and in Ukraine meant that small-time farmers, especially if you combine this with the globalization of agricultural commodity markets and industrialized transportation systems based on steam power that extend further into the provinces, that means that now the comparison point for the grain you bring to your village train station in central Germany is the price of grain in Kiev or Odessa and in Chicago. And if you can't compete with that, you're out of a job. And at the same time, with the railroad, come Jewish peddlers, come Jewish horse traders, and so forth. So this becomes the birthplace of the anti-Semitic party. There's another angle, another strain to this, where it's about not just the economic side of liberalism, but the ideas of liberalism, equality, citizenship, religious tolerance, and so forth, that go hand in hand with expanding opportunities and reduced discrimination when it comes to Jews, that reactionaries too link with Jews as a group to blame. And therefore, my view of what proper concept of anti-Semitism would entail is, of course, a discussion of the relationship between the mainstream of the two like big lines of development of modern history, modernity and capital, and to see in the form and in the spread of anti-Semitism an expression of the contradiction within modernity and capitalism. So if you reduce it to this friend-foe scheme, good Jews versus bad Muslims, bad white European Jews versus good Palestinians, you're not doing it justice. And to the extent that these contradictions that come with modernity and with capitalism go unrecognized, they also are more harmful and do more damage. And the way to understand those, or one way to understand those, is precisely to read Hegel and Marx, who worked through, in Hegel's case, tensions and contradictions in the modern system of government and philosophy, and Marx specifically when it comes to capitalism. So when we're talking about ethnicity, and we're talking about religion, and when we're not talking about constitutional government, the modern centralized bureaucratic state, and capital, then we have no grounds to have a sensible conversation about anti-Semitism or any other issue to do with race, religion, or ethnicity. But in this particular case, the consequence is so especially dire because it just means people will dumbly line up to support one or the other side in an unwinnable struggle under the current and given conditions. that will be more likely than anything to end up with the victory of those religious fanatics in this country who are hoping for a nuclear global blowout because that'll usher in the reign of Jesus. And in which, no, I'm dead serious. Yeah, because then, and at that point, the Jews will be converted and then we're done. I hope for these people, they never get to meet Jesus.